Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I was Mary Collins, a 66-year-old widow who had spent years holding my family together in silence, paying their mortgage, their children's school, even their lavish Christmas parties, all without a word of thanks. I believed love meant sacrifice until the night I stood at my own son's doorstep, gifts in my hands, and was told I was not welcome inside. In that moment, the world seemed to stop, and I learned what it truly meant to be invisible in the family I had built. The cold air stung my cheeks as I stepped carefully up the stone walkway, balancing the tin of sugar cookies wrapped in red ribbon in one hand and a neatly wrapped box in the other. The house was glowing, every window framed with golden lights, a giant wreath on the door, laughter spilling out into the night. My son's home looked like something out of a holiday magazine, perfect and polished, the kind of Christmas party people posted about to prove how charmed their lives were. I paused for a second at the front door, smoothing my coat, steadying my breath. Robert used to stand beside me at moments like this. Since he passed 6 years ago, I had learned to arrive alone, to swallow whatever sting came with that, and to remind myself that I still belonged. I pressed the doorbell and shifted the weight of the gifts in my arms. The door opened almost immediately, and there was Jen, her blonde hair curled perfectly, her lips painted crimson. Behind her, I could hear carols playing, the murmur of conversation, clinking glasses. She gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that practiced hostess smile that looked warm to outsiders, but cold as ice up close. She let her gaze drop to the tin in my hand, then lifted it again, sharp. "Mary," she said lightly, "we want to keep the party very intimate this year, just close friends. You don't need to come in." The words struck me harder than I expected. For a moment, the sound in the house seemed to vanish, as if someone had stuffed cotton in my ears. I saw the shape of people moving in the living room shadows, laughing, unaware that at the door I was being turned away like a stranger. My fingers tightened on the tin of cookies. I thought of the recipe card written in Robert's mother's handwriting, the way he used to steal one cookie hot from the tray, laughing like a boy. I thought of Ellie and Jack waiting to unwrap presents, the ones I had tucked into the gift bag with careful bows. I wanted to ask Jen why I wanted to demand to see my son, to tell her I had a right to stand inside my son's home at Christmas. But instead, my throat closed around the words. I looked at her, nodded once, and turned. My boots crunched on the frosty walkway. Behind me, I caught a glimpse of 2 guests lingering by the hallway arch, curiosity flickering on their faces, as if they could sense something had just happened. I pulled my scarf tighter, walking into the night air that smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. The street was quiet except for the distant sound of carols from other homes. My car was parked under a bare maple tree dusted with frost. I opened the door, slid the cookies and gift onto the passenger seat, and sat for a moment gripping the steering wheel. My chest ached with a pressure that felt like humiliation and grief tangled together. I blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall here, not on this street where someone might look out a window and see. Driving back to my condo, the roads empty at this hour, I tried to steady my breathing. Christmas lights blurred in my vision. I thought of Robert again, of how he used to drive with one hand on the wheel, the other holding mine, telling me that no matter what, family was everything. I wondered what he would say now, if he would be disappointed in me for walking away so quietly, or proud that I had chosen dignity over a scene. When I reached the small brick building where I lived, I parked and carried the tin and the gift inside. The hallway smelled faintly of someone's dinner garlic and butter. Unlocking my door, I was greeted by silence. I set the cookies on the counter, unwrapped my scarf, and touched the little tree I had decorated 2 weeks ago. It was only 4 feet tall fake with ornaments collected over decades. One ornament was especially dear, a porcelain angel Robert had bought the year Ellie was born. I ran my fingers over it, feeling a tremor in my hands. I placed the wrapped present under the tree. It was a sweater for Ellie's soft blue wool I had chosen after seeing how much she loved that color. I pictured her face when she opened it, but I knew she would not see it tonight, maybe not at all. The ache in my chest deepened. I sat in Robert's old armchair by the window. The night outside was calm, the streetlights casting long shadows across the snow. Inside my living room, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. I pulled the blanket over my lap, trying to warm myself, but it was not the cold air that made me shiver. It was the feeling of being pushed aside, erased from the story of a family I had once believed I belonged to at the very center. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the silence press in. My hands curled against the fabric of the chair nails, digging lightly, as if gripping something invisible. I could still hear Jen's voice, sweet on the surface, cutting underneath. I forced my breath to slow. There would be time later for questions, for decisions. For now, all I had was this silence, heavy and unbroken, wrapping around me like a second skin. I opened my eyes and stared at the tree across the room, the glow of its lights reflecting off the ornaments. The small apartment was modest, but it was mine. And for tonight, that would have to be enough. I reached for the light switch beside my chair and let the room dim except for the tree glowing quietly in the corner. The soft light caught the edges of the ornaments, and I felt my chest tighten. My thoughts drifted back to the night Robert died in 2017, a sudden heart attack that left me stunned and alone at 60. He had always managed our finances careful and steady, and after the funeral, I found myself staring at stacks of papers, insurance forms, and bank statements, wondering how to navigate it all. The life insurance payout had looked large at first glance, but I knew enough to realize it was meant to stretch for decades, not vanish in a few years. That winter, Mark sat at my kitchen table with his hands clasped and eyes lowered. "Mom," he said, "the investment firm is just getting on its feet, and we are a little behind on the mortgage. It will just be for a couple of months until my commission comes in." Jen hovered behind him, arms folded, looking concerned, but already confident that I would say yes. I did not hesitate. I wrote a check telling myself it was temporary, that Robert would have wanted me to support our son through a rough patch. 2 months stretched into 6, then into a pattern. By early 2018, I had set up an automatic transfer of $3,400 each month straight into their mortgage account. They did not even need to ask anymore. I told myself it was easier this way, less embarrassing for them, less awkward for me. I let them believe Mark's firm had finally taken off, that he was providing comfortably for his family. Not long after Jen mentioned over coffee that Ridgemont Academy was the best possible school for Ellie and Jack, with networking opportunities and elite teachers. She spoke as if the decision was already made. Mark nodded along, proud. I smiled, swallowed the sting of doubt, and called the school myself. I set up another transfer, $1,500 each month, direct to tuition. My name was nowhere on the paperwork. They were listed as the parents paying full tuition, successful and admired. By the end of that first year, I had already given them nearly $60,000. I would look at the totals late at night, sitting in Robert's chair with the lamp on, adding up the numbers. $3,400 here, $1,500 there, plus extras. When their SUV broke down, I covered the repair. When Jen insisted they needed a new dining room set to impress clients, I slipped her a check. When Mark admitted his credit card was maxed, I wired money to clear the balance. Each time he said it was temporary, and each time I nodded, telling myself that was what mothers did. Christmas of 2018 was the first catered holiday dinner I paid for without them even asking. Jen texted me the order form from Marlowe's Catering with the note, "Same as last year, thanks." I did not argue. I called, placed the order, handed over my card. At the party, I watched guests praise the spread of prime rib and shrimp cocktail. Jen smiled graciously and Mark clinked glasses. I sat at the end of the table eating quietly, pretending not to notice that no one thanked me. The years blurred together. By 2019, the transfers were routine. I no longer thought of the money as mine. My modest pension and what was left of the insurance went into my condo fees, utilities, and groceries. Everything else flowed to Mark and Jen. They seemed happier, their home, more polished, their lives more enviable. Neighbors admired their new landscaping. The school praised their commitment to education. Friends marveled at the catered parties. I watched from the edges, invisible. Sometimes at night I would talk to Robert's photograph. I would whisper that I was doing what he would have wanted, that I was keeping our family strong. But in the quiet doubt crept in. Robert had always valued living within our means. He would never have allowed so much pretense. Still, I could not bring myself to stop. The children were thriving. Ellie brought home stories from Ridgemont about advanced reading programs. Jack beamed about his soccer team. Their smiles were enough to keep me silent. By 2020, the total had passed 150,000. The pandemic made everything more fragile. Mark insisted the firm was struggling, but holding on. Jen sent photos of the children on their laptops at home. I dropped groceries on their porch when stores were chaotic, careful not to intrude. I watched my own retirement balance dip further, but convinced myself it was temporary. In 2021, Jen pushed for renovations to keep up with the neighborhood. Mark said it was crucial for resale value. I knew the truth, but I signed the check anyway. That Christmas, as I set a tray of my homemade cookies on the counter, Jen told me gently that the caterer had already provided desserts. My cookies stayed wrapped in foil untouched. I smiled as if it did not matter, but in my chest something cracked. By 2022, I could not deny the numbers anymore. I kept a folder in my desk, every transfer, every receipt neatly filed. When I totaled it one evening, the sum made me dizzy. Over $250,000, nearly 2/3 of everything Robert had left me. I stared at the number, my hand trembling. I told myself it was worth it because Ellie was flourishing, because Jack had chances we never dreamed of, but deep down I knew the truth. And then came 2023. I added another $60,000 by fall, the mortgage, the tuition, the endless extras. $312,000 in total, drained quietly while I smiled and nodded. When Jen's text arrived with the catering request for Christmas, I placed the order as always, even though my account balance shrank dangerously low. I told myself I would manage, that Robert would approve. I sat now in the quiet of my condo, staring at the glow of my small tree, thinking about every dollar, every silent choice. I had given them so much and asked for nothing in return. They believed the story of Mark's success. They believed in the life they paraded before friends. And I had let them believe it year after year. The night air outside was still snow gathering softly on the sill. I pressed my palm to my chest, feeling the weight of years of silence. In the dim glow of the tree, I knew something was shifting inside me. The silence that once felt like love now pressed heavy, suffocating, waiting to break. It began with little things that seemed harmless at first. Small remarks slipped into conversations that I tried to laugh off. One Easter Sunday, Jen looked at my cardigan and asked if I had anything more current in my closet, something less dated. I smiled politely, but the words lodged in me. Later that year, I brought one of Robert's favorite casseroles to a family dinner. Jen thanked me with a tight smile and whispered to Mark just loud enough for me to hear that the kids were used to organic now. I told myself it was her way of being particular, that maybe she wanted everything perfect, but it was hard not to feel the edge in her voice. At birthdays, I noticed where I was seated. The children's table was close to the head of the room, and Jen's friends and family filled the center. My chair was always at the far end near the hallway, or next to someone elderly who could not hear well. I found myself smiling and nodding, straining to catch pieces of conversation while laughter and stories passed easily among the others. When I brought cookies, the ones I had made every holiday since Robert and I were newlyweds, they were often set aside in the kitchen while catered desserts were arranged on silver trays. My cookies cooled untouched, and I pretended not to notice. The gifts I gave were unwrapped politely and then placed to the side. A sweater, a book I thought Jen might like, toys for the children, all accepted with quick thank yous before attention shifted to something larger, shinier, more expensive, usually from Mark and Jen themselves. I realized with a sinking feeling that much of what they gave had been funded by me, but no one knew that. I was invisible both in credit and in presence. I told myself these were minor things, that family bonds were stronger than seating charts and side comments. But each year I felt myself moved further from the center of the family I had helped build. Mark said little when Jen spoke that way. If I glanced at him hoping for a word of defense, he avoided my eyes. He looked down at his plate or across the room, pretending not to notice. The boy I had raised, who once clung to my hand in crowded grocery stores, now stood beside his wife in silence while I was dismissed. One Thanksgiving in 2020 stays in my mind. I had brought a pie homemade. The crust hand rolled the way Robert loved. Jen took it from my hands at the door and set it on the counter. Later after dinner, I saw it still there untouched, while guests enjoyed pumpkin cheesecake from the caterer. I asked Jen if anyone might like a slice of mine. She gave me a smile that was all teeth and said the table was already full, maybe another time. My cheeks burned as if the whole room had heard her. At Christmas the same year, Ellie tugged my hand and asked if we could make cookies together. I said of course, and we decorated sugar cookies with sprinkles and frosting in the kitchen. When we carried the tray out, Jen intercepted us and slid the plate back into the kitchen. She told Ellie that guests had already had plenty of dessert. I saw confusion on my granddaughter's face, then disappointment. I wanted to protest, but Mark caught my eye, gave me a look that said, "Let it go." So I did. The more I let it go, the more it continued. By 2021, I was hardly asked about family decisions. Jen chose the school activities, the vacations, the holiday menus. When I suggested a family trip to Maine like Robert and I used to take, she laughed lightly and said the children were more interested in Florida resorts. Mark nodded along. I realized my opinions were no longer sought, only tolerated. That Christmas, they asked me to arrive later than usual. By the time I got there, most of the festivities were already underway. The living room was crowded, music playing, laughter filling every corner. I hovered near the door with my coat still on, unsure where to put my things. Jen walked by, kissed my cheek quickly, and disappeared into the crowd. I wandered until I found a seat near the kitchen, not with family, but next to a distant relative who barely knew my name. My voice felt small as I tried to make conversation over the noise. By 2022, it had become routine. I would bring something, it would be dismissed. I would offer to help. I would be told everything was handled. I began to feel like a guest in my own son's home, a guest who was not entirely welcome. I noticed Jen's friends looking at me with polite smiles, as if they were not sure why I was there at all. I caught whispers, quick glances, the sense that my presence was an obligation more than a joy. Mark remained quiet through it all. Once driving me home after a birthday dinner, I asked softly if Jen had an issue with me. He gripped the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road, and said she was just particular, that I should not take it personally. But how could I not? Each slight, each dismissal cut a little deeper. I began to dread the holidays instead of anticipating them. I still went, still smiled, still handed over gifts and trays of food, but inside I carried a weight that grew heavier each year. I thought often of Robert and what he would think if he saw me now. He would have told me to speak up, to stand tall, but every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. I convinced myself it was better not to make trouble, better to be quiet for the sake of peace. Looking back now, I see how all those small wounds were warnings. Each year, I was moved further from the center until I was nearly erased. By the time Jen stood at the door on Christmas night of 2023 telling me not to come in, I should not have been surprised. The rejection had been coming for years, written in every cold smile, every untouched cookie, every seat at the edge of the table. It was only that night she finally said out loud what had long been true. The sun was barely up when I found myself awake, staring at the ceiling as if the night had never really ended. My body felt heavy, but my mind was buzzing with a clarity I had not felt in years. I moved quietly through the apartment, made a pot of coffee, and sat down at the desk in the corner where my old laptop waited. The tree still glowed softly in the corner of the room, ornaments reflecting the pale morning light. I told myself it was time. Enough of waiting, enough of pretending. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before I logged into my bank account. The familiar rows of scheduled payments lined up neatly on the screen as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. $3,400 for Mark and Jen's mortgage, $1,500 for Ridgemont Academy, a catering deposit already charged with the remainder due after the Christmas party I was no longer welcome at. There were other smaller transfers too, ones I barely noticed anymore, the casual bailouts that had become routine. The numbers stared back at me, unapologetic, expecting me to keep being who I had been for the past 5 years. I clicked on the first transfer, the mortgage. A simple box popped up asking if I was sure I wanted to cancel. My hand trembled, but I pressed yes. The word confirmed appeared, and something inside me loosened. I canceled the tuition next, then the catering payment, then every automatic transfer attached to their accounts. By the time I finished, the screen looked startlingly bare. For the first time in years, my money wasn't already claimed before I could breathe. I leaned back in my chair, pressing my palm to my chest. The trembling in my hands spread through my whole body, but it was not fear this time. It was release. Still shaking, I picked up the phone and dialed Rick Harper, Robert's old friend, who had managed our finances since before I was married. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Mary, it has been too long." "What is going on?" My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. "Rick, I need help. I have been supporting Mark and Jen. I need you to look at what I have done." He asked for the details, so I told him. I explained the mortgage payments, the tuition, the catering bills, the repairs, the extras, all of it. My voice faltered as the list grew longer, but I kept going because the truth could no longer stay hidden. There was silence on the other end when I finished. Then Rick spoke slower now. "Mary, do you understand what this means? You have given them over $300,000 since Robert passed. That is more than half of your retirement savings." I pressed my forehead to the desk, gripping the phone tighter. "I thought I was helping," I whispered. Rick's sigh carried both kindness and disbelief. Helping is buying groceries once in a while or covering an emergency. What you are describing is not helping. It is sacrificing your future. If you keep this up in 4 years, you will be broke. Completely broke. The words hit like a blow. 4 years. That was all the time left between me and nothing. I sat there stunned, staring at the small crack in the desk's finish where Robert once spilled his coffee. I tried to picture myself at 70, with nothing to live on, no security, no choices. A widow who had spent everything to keep her son's image intact. I could almost hear Robert's voice steady and firm, reminding me that he had worked too hard for our savings to vanish like this. I swallowed hard. "I canceled all of it this morning," I said quietly. Rick paused, then said, "Good. That is the first step. Now we need to restructure what is left. Bring me your folder, every record you have kept. We will put the truth down in numbers so you can see it clearly." When I hung up, the apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I opened the drawer where I had kept the folder hidden. Inside were 5 years of statements, transfers, receipts, and notes in my own handwriting. The papers were worn from being handled so many times, corners bent, ink smudged. I ran my fingers over the thick stack, feeling the weight of all that silence. I placed it on the desk, promising myself I would carry it to Rick's office this week. The phone buzzed again, and I reached for it, expecting maybe Rick with another thought. Instead, it was a text from Jen. "Same as last year, 30 people. Can you take care of the catering again?" No greeting, no gratitude, no acknowledgement that I had been told not to attend the party. Just the same assumption, as if nothing had changed, as if my wallet was still open and waiting. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. For a moment, my thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could have written a reply. I could have told her I was done, that the well had run dry, that her cruelty last night had broken something inside me. But then I thought of all the years I had explained, excused, and justified only to be ignored. I set the phone face down on the table and pressed delete. The message vanished. My hand steadied. I stood and moved slowly through the apartment, touching the edges of furniture, the picture frames on the walls, the little things that had been mine and Robert's before life had become so complicated. On the bookshelf sat a photo of us on our wedding day, young and smiling, full of hope. Next to it was the ornament from our first Christmas together, the porcelain angel that had followed us through every home. I picked it up, cradled it in my palm, and whispered into the empty room that I was sorry it had taken me this long. I set the ornament back gently and returned to the window. Outside, the street was coated in a fresh layer of snow. The branches of the maples glistened in the light, and the air seemed still waiting. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around me and stood there, breathing deeply, letting the silence settle into my bones. Somewhere across town, Jen was likely polishing silver, arranging flowers, preparing to host another perfect evening. Mark was probably convincing himself that everything was fine. but here in my small apartment, something had shifted. The woman who had nodded and smiled and paid every bill was gone. In her place was someone who had finally said no, someone who had chosen to protect what was left of her life. I pressed my hand against the glass, feeling the cold seep through and let the truth sink in. I had broken the pattern, and I knew there was no turning back. The first day passed quietly, and I almost convinced myself that nothing would happen, that Mark and Jen would find a way to handle their own bills without me. I went about my routine, folded laundry, watered the plant in the window, and tried to pretend I had not just undone 5 years of silent sacrifice. But by the third morning, the consequences arrived with the force of a storm. I was making oatmeal when the first call came. The phone lit up with Mark's name, his picture from years ago when he was still in college, his smile open and boyish. My heart clenched, but I did not answer. A few minutes later, another call came, then another. When I finally pressed play on the voicemail, his voice was sharp and urgent. "Mom, the school just called. The tuition check bounced. They said they can't register Ellie and Jack for next semester unless it's paid immediately. There must be some mistake. Call me back." I set the spoon down, appetite gone, and stared at the gray light outside the kitchen window. The maple tree branches were bare, the sidewalk coated with thin ice. There was no mistake. I had canceled it all. My hands shook slightly as I rinsed the bowl in the sink, but I did not pick up the phone. By late morning, there were 6 missed calls and 4 voicemails. I sat at my desk with the folder open, flipping through the pages of bank statements, invoices, receipts. The numbers stared back at me, undeniable proof of everything I had carried alone. My phone buzzed again, this time Jen's voice flooding the voicemail box. "Mary Yepes Catering says the order was canceled. Do you realize what this means? We cannot replace them at this late notice. Guests are coming in 2 days. How could you do this without telling us?" Her voice cracked on the last word, but not with worry for me, only with fury that her perfect image might crumble. I closed the folder and placed it neatly on the desk, my fingers steadying as I did. I would not let her voice shake me anymore. The rest of the afternoon was relentless. The bank called their house, the school left messages, and when they reached Mark or Jen, they came straight back to me. The screen lit up again and again until the number of missed calls blurred together. I left the phone face down on the counter, turning to the stove instead. I simmered a pot of soup-chopped carrots and celery and let the steam fill the kitchen. The simple act of cooking for myself felt grounding, something I had not done just for me in a long time. By the time the clock struck 4, the tally had risen to 15 missed calls and 9 voicemails. I poured a glass of wine and sat in Robert's old armchair, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar. The tree twinkled softly in the corner, its lights reflected in the window. I sipped slowly, letting the quiet settle around me. But quiet was not what waited in the phone. Out of curiosity or maybe defiance, I pressed play once more. Jen's voice rang out harsher than before. "Mary, this is not acceptable. You cannot just decide to stop without warning. Do you know what you are doing to us? The children will suffer. The mortgage is due, the school is threatening us, and now the party is ruined. All because you are upset over one holiday. You cannot be this petty. Call me back now." I felt a heat rise in my chest, but not shame. Anger, clean and sharp. Petty. That was the word she chose after I had quietly shouldered more than $300,000 for their comfort. I closed my eyes and breathed until the anger settled into something steadier, a determination I had not felt in years. The next morning when I turned the phone on again, the number startled me. 27 missed calls, 12 new voicemails, a dozen texts stacked one after the other. Mark's voice filled the first message, less controlled than before. "Mom, please just call us back. We need to figure this out. The mortgage company called and said the payment was not received. They are threatening late fees. I do not understand why this is happening. Just call me." I let the message end, then pressed delete. The next one played automatically. Jen again, her voice climbing higher with every sentence. "This is sabotage, Mary. You are tearing this family apart. Do you want us to lose the house? Do you want the kids pulled out of school? All because of your pride. You cannot do this to us." I set the phone down on the table, the words echoing through the room. All because of my pride. Not once did they ask if I was all right, if something had happened to me, if I needed help. Their panic was about Bill's party's appearances. Nothing more. I turned the phone off completely and slid it into the drawer with the folder. The silence that followed was heavy, but also freeing. For the first time in years, I was not rushing to patch holes in their lives. I walked to the balcony, opened the sliding door, and let the December air rush in. It was sharp and bracing, smelling faintly of wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. I wrapped my cardigan tight and stood there, breathing deeply. Somewhere across town, Mark and Jen were scrambling, shouting, maybe blaming each other. They were learning slowly and painfully what it meant to live within their own means. I stayed on the balcony until my fingers grew numb, then returned inside. I reheated the soup, poured another glass of wine, and curled into Robert's chair. The glow of the tree reflected in the window, steady and calm. The phone remained dark in the drawer, and for once I let it. The knock on my door came 2 nights later, sharp and insistent, loud enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. I froze with a dish towel in my hand, heart pounding. When the knocking came again, harder this time, I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Mark stood in the hallway, face flushed, shoulders stiff beneath his winter coat. Behind him, Jen hovered with her arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. Without waiting for an invitation, Mark stepped past me into the apartment, his voice rising before the door had even closed. "Mom, what is going on? The mortgage company called. The school is threatening to suspend enrollment. The caterer says the order was canceled. Why are you doing this?" His words tumbled out in a rush, overlapping, desperate. I shut the door quietly and turned to face them. Jen had already moved further inside, scanning the room with sharp eyes, as if looking for evidence. She shook her head, disgust written across her face. "You cannot just cut us off like this. Do you have any idea what kind of position you have put us in?" I placed the towel on the counter and folded my hands together to keep them from shaking. My voice came out calm, steadier than I felt. "I have supported you for 5 years. I have paid your mortgage, your children's tuition, your parties. That ends now." Mark blinked, his mouth opening, then closing. He glanced at Jen as if hoping she would correct me. She gave a short laugh, bitter and sharp. "That is ridiculous. Where would you even get that kind of money? We have been paying our own way. Do not make things up to justify this tantrum." The words stung, but I had prepared myself for them. I walked slowly to the desk against the wall and pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside sat the thick folder I had carried for years, stuffed with bank statements and receipts. I rested my hand on the couch. My eyes met Jen's. "I am not making this up." Her smirk faltered for just a second before she recovered. She folded her arms tighter and said, "If you think you can scare us with a pile of papers, go ahead. But you cannot just stop. You owe it to the kids to keep things steady. I felt a tremor of anger push against the calm I was trying to hold. I owe nothing, I said evenly. I did this quietly, without acknowledgement, without thanks. I drained my savings while you smiled for your friends and took the credit. No more. Mark stepped closer, his voice dropping, but still frantic. Mom, you cannot just pull out now. We have commitments. The kids are settled at Ridgemont. If the tuition is not paid, they will lose their spots. Do you want that on your conscience? I turned toward him, and for the first time in years, I did not see my son, the boy who once rode on Robert's shoulders at the fair. I saw a man who had never learned to stand on his own, who had let his wife's ambition swallow him whole. The realization hurt, but it also cleared the fog from my mind. The choices you made are yours to live with, I said. I will not be your safety net anymore. Jen scoffed loudly. Safety net? You are delusional. If you had that much money to give, why are you living in this tiny apartment? You are just bitter because you were not invited to one party. The words landed like ice, but I refused to let her see me flinch. My hand pressed firmer against the folder, reminding myself of its weight. I kept my voice low. You are welcome to believe whatever you like. But you know the truth, and deep down, so does Mark. Mark's face reddened further, and he ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small living room. Mom, please think about this. We cannot cover the bills this month without your help. For years, those words would have broken me, would have sent me rushing to open my checkbook. But not anymore. I stood straighter, my shoulders firm. That is not my problem, I said. The silence that followed was thick, filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Jen's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Mark finally stopped pacing, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of my words pressed down on him. I stepped back toward the door and opened it. You should go, I said softly. Jen let out a harsh laugh, but moved past me into the hallway. Mark hesitated, his eyes darting once to the desk drawer where my hand still rested. He looked like he wanted to speak, but instead, he followed his wife out into the cold. When the door clicked shut behind them, I leaned against it, my breath coming hard. My body trembled, but not from fear, from the power of standing my ground. I walked back to the desk, slid the folder back into the drawer, and closed it gently. The weight of it remained in the room, a silent reminder that I was no longer powerless. The apartment was quiet again. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, soft flakes drifting past the streetlight. I pulled the shawl around my shoulders and sank into Robert's chair. For the first time in years, I felt steady. The fight was only beginning, I knew, but tonight the silence belonged to me. 3 mornings later, I found a thick envelope wedged in my mailbox, heavier than the usual catalogs and bills. The return address was a law office downtown, embossed in tidy letters that immediately made my stomach tighten. I carried it upstairs with trembling hands, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a long moment before breaking the seal. Inside was a formal letter dense with legal language. My eyes tripped over the phrases, but the meaning was clear enough. It claimed that by consistently providing financial support for Mark and Jen's household over the past 5 years, I had established a dependency that obligated me to continue. They demanded I resume the mortgage and tuition payments immediately or risk legal action. I pressed my palms flat on the table, trying to steady my breath. For a brief, dizzy moment, I pictured myself in a courtroom, accused of abandoning my own family, shamed before strangers. Fear slid through me, sharp and quick. What if they could force me? What if the law truly was on their side? The phone sat silent on the counter, and I reached for it as if it were a lifeline. I dialed Rick's office and was patched through quickly. His voice came across the line, calm, the same voice that had guided Robert and me through mortgages, insurance, and retirement plans decades ago. "Rick, I said I received a letter. I think they are threatening to sue me." "Bring it by," he said, and I was in his office within the hour. His desk was cluttered with papers, his glasses perched low on his nose. He skimmed the letter once, then again, more slowly, lips twitching, as if he was trying not to laugh. "Mary," he finally said, "there is no legal ground here. None. Parents are not obligated to support adult children unless there is a contract and you never signed anything. This is intimidation, nothing more." I let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half disbelief. I thought, what if they really could take me to court? Rick shook his head, leaned back in his chair. "They can try, but no judge in this state will entertain it. In fact, if they press too hard, it will backfire. You have documentation of everything correct." I nodded and slid the folder across the desk. He opened it, flipping through the neatly stacked papers, his eyebrows climbing. "Good Lord, Mary, you could fill a filing cabinet with this. Transfers, receipts, tuition statements. You have more than enough to prove exactly what has happened. If anything, this protects you." As he spoke, a warmth spread through me, not comfort exactly, but a sense of strength returning. For so long I had hidden these records out of embarrassment, ashamed that I had let it go this far. Now I realized they were my shield. Rick tapped the folder. "Keep these safe. I will draft a response to their lawyer making it clear you have no legal obligation. If they push further, we can consider our own action, but I doubt it will come to that. People like Jen usually fold once they realize they cannot bully their way through." I left his office feeling lighter, though my hands still trembled when I gripped the steering wheel. On the drive home, the winter sun broke briefly through the clouds, lighting the icy branches along the road. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel trapped. Back in my apartment, I brewed tea and sat at the window, the letter from their lawyer tucked away now, replaced by the steady presence of the folder in my desk. I thought about Jen, about the sharpness in her voice, the way she had always looked down her nose at my clothes, my food, my very presence. It did not surprise me that she had turned to lawyers as soon as she lost control. It was exactly her style, all image and intimidation. Mark's face, however, lingered in my mind differently. I wondered if he had read the letter before it was sent, if he had agreed to it, or simply let her act on his behalf like he always did. The boy who once ran to me with scraped knees had grown into a man who could not stand against his wife, even when she dragged his own mother into a legal threat. The grief of that realization cut deeper than any lawyer's letter ever could. The phone rang that evening, their number flashing again. I let it ring, knowing there would be another voicemail waiting. When I finally played it back hours later, Jen's voice snapped through the speaker. "We know you got the letter. You cannot just walk away from your responsibilities. Think carefully before you embarrass yourself." I pressed delete without hesitation. My responsibilities had been twisted and used against me, but they were mine to define now. I stood stretched and walked to the window where the snow was falling in slow, steady flakes. The city lights blurred against the white, and the apartment was quiet, peaceful, in a way it had not been for years. I placed my hand on the desk drawer where the folder rested. The file, as I had begun to think of it, was not just paper. It was the truth I had carried silently now, waiting to speak for me if needed. The fear that had spiked when I first opened that envelope was already fading, replaced by the certainty that this time I was not powerless. The following afternoon, the phone rang again, and this time the name flashing on the screen startled me. It was not Mark or Jen. It was Marlowe Green, the man who owned Green's Catering, the same company that had delivered roasted turkey's prime rib and endless trays of hors d'oeuvres to my son's house every December. I hesitated before answering, unsure why he would be calling me directly, then pressed the button. Mary, his voice came through tight and clipped. I hope you do not mind me reaching out, but something has come to my attention that I cannot ignore. I gripped the receiver, my heart suddenly thudding. Go on, I said. He let out a sharp breath, heavy with irritation. I was at an event last night where one of Jennifer's friends was bragging about her holiday parties. Apparently, Jen told the whole table she and Mark had been longtime clients of mine, paying top dollar for years. She even dismissed me when I corrected her, saying perhaps I was confusing accounts. That is a lie, Mary. Every single invoice has been billed to you, every year without fail. The words stung even though I already knew the truth. Hearing it from someone outside the family, someone who had no stake in this but his own reputation, made Jen's deceit sharper, more public. I swallowed. You are right, Marlowe, I said softly. I have paid every bill. His voice softened slightly, though the anger still simmered. I have no interest in family disputes, but I will not let my business be used as a prop in her stories. If anyone questions it, I will produce the records. You should know I keep everything: signed receipts, email confirmations, credit card slips. For a moment I sat in silence, relief mingling with grief. Thank you, Marlowe, I whispered. That means more than I can explain. After we hung up, I moved quickly as if guided by instinct. I opened my email and found his message already waiting. Attached were scans of invoices dating back to 2018, each one stamped paid with my name on the account. I printed them page after page, the sound of the machine steady in the quiet apartment. When I was done, I slid the new stack into the folder that had become both burden and shield. The file grew thicker, heavier, undeniable. I carried it to the table and sat with it in front of me. My fingers traced the edges, and I thought of all the nights I had hidden these records away, ashamed of my silence. Now they were becoming something else, not just a reminder of what I had lost, but proof that I had not imagined it, that my sacrifices had been real. That evening I made myself a simple dinner: soup and bread, and turned on the tree lights. The ornaments sparkled softly against the window. Yet even in that calm glow, Jen's voice returned sharp in my memory, mocking me at the door, calling me petty, insisting I owed her lifestyle. Now I had more than my word. I had witnesses, people outside the walls of that house who could confirm the truth. The phone buzzed again just as I set the dishes in the sink. I let it go to voicemail, then pressed play when the icon blinked. Jen's voice came brittle with fury. Mary, how dare you involve Marlowe? He called us this afternoon. You have no right to drag outsiders into private family matters. If you think embarrassing us will help your case, you are wrong. This is between us, and it will stay that way. I deleted the message halfway through. The irony was too bitter. She had dragged lawyers into it, first sending letters meant to frighten me. Now she wanted to keep it private because the truth had slipped beyond her control. I returned to the folder and added Marlowe's email, printed and signed his words, confirming my payments year after year. I pressed the pages flat, feeling steadier with every document I added. The file was not just paper anymore. It was a voice that could not be silenced, a story Jen could not rewrite. Later restless, I wrapped a scarf around my shoulders and walked down the block to the cafe. The sidewalks were dusted with snow, the air sharp and clean. Inside, the windows fogged with warmth, I ordered coffee and chose a seat near the glass. I set the folder on the table and opened it carefully, reviewing page after page. Transfers, tuition payments, catering invoices, now backed by Marlowe's records. For 5 years, I had carried the weight alone, invisible. Now, slowly, the world outside that family was beginning to see it too. A young couple sat nearby, laughing quietly over their drinks. I watched them for a moment and thought about Robert and me when we were that age, when our biggest worry was whether we could afford a weekend trip to the shore. He would have hated what I had allowed, but I knew he would have been proud that I was finally finding my strength. When I finished my coffee, I tucked the folder back into my bag and stepped into the cold night. The street lamps cast a golden glow on the snow, and my boots left crisp prints behind me. Back in the apartment, I placed the folder in the desk drawer, closed it gently, and sat in Robert's chair. The quiet of the room wrapped around me, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt protective. I looked at the tree the porcelain angel perched at the top and breathed deeply. The battle was far from over. Mark and Jen would not stop pushing, but I was no longer afraid. With every document, every witness, the truth was building a wall they could not tear down. And this time, I intended to stand behind it. The evening they returned was colder than most, the kind of sharp December chill that pressed against the windows and slipped under the doorframe. I had been expecting them ever since the lawyer's letter and Marlowe's call, and when the knock finally came, I felt no surprise. I set aside my teacup, crossed the room, and opened the door. Mark stood in the hallway with his coat unbuttoned, his expression tight and wary. Jen was beside him, her lips curved in a thin smile that never reached her eyes. She carried a manila envelope under one arm, its flap barely closed. I stepped back without a word and let them in. Mark wasted no time. "Mom, this has gone on long enough. We cannot keep going in circles." He gestured toward the envelope. "We had a lawyer draft something. It will make everything clear. You sign and there will not be any more confusion." Jen set the envelope on the table, sliding it toward me as though she were delivering a contract to a client. Her voice was smooth, practiced. "This is just formalizing what has always been there. You know we depend on you, Mary. It is best to put it in writing." I looked at the envelope without touching it. My heart was steady, not racing as it once would have. Then, without answering, I walked to the desk. From the bottom drawer, I pulled the thick folder that had become both burden and shield. I placed it on the table with a soft thud that made Jen flinch. "What is that?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. I opened the cover and spread out the first stack. Bank statements, each highlighted to show the monthly transfers. Mortgage payments, $3,400 every month for 5 years. I pushed them forward so they covered the neat envelope she had brought. Next, I laid out the tuition invoices from Ridgemont Academy. Each one bore my name, each one marked paid. I placed them in a row that stretched across the table like a timeline of my silence. Then came the catering receipts. Marlowe's logo at the top, my card at the bottom, year after year of December feasts. Trays of prime rib salmon pastries, wine. Every line item signed by me. Finally, I added the sheet Rick had helped me prepare, the summary that totaled it all. $312,000. More than half of my savings gone into their home, their image, their life. The room grew very still. Jen's hand hovered above the papers before she finally picked up one of the receipts, scanning it with a frown that deepened into something sharper. She flipped to another, then another, her movements growing slower as the truth pressed down. Mark leaned in, his lips moving silently as his eyes darted across the numbers. His face drained of color. His hand shook when he reached for the summary page. "Mom," he whispered, "I did not know." I met his gaze, my voice calm. "Of course you did not. You never asked. You only took." He winced, the words hitting harder than I expected. For a moment he looked like the boy I once knew, lost and ashamed. Jen dropped the papers back onto the table and crossed her arms. "This does not change anything. You chose to give. No one forced you." I gathered the pages slowly, stacking them neatly. "And now I choose to stop." Mark rubbed his forehead, his shoulders hunched. His voice was softer now. "But the kids' mom? Their school, their house. What happens to them?" I thought of Ellie's bright eyes, Jack's easy laugh, their small hands in mine. They were the only ones I worried for, but they were not enough reason to let myself be erased. "That is your responsibility," I said gently, "not mine." Jen's jaw tightened. "Do you realize how humiliating this will be when people find out? Do you know what they will say about us?" I closed the folder and looked at her evenly. "The humiliation is not mine to bear." She opened her mouth again, but no words came. For the first time since I had known her, Jen was silent. Mark sank into the nearest chair, his eyes still fixed on the folder. He looked broken open, the weight of those papers crushing whatever illusions he had clung to. I almost felt pity, but then I remembered the years of silence. The holidays spent at the edge of the table, the way he had turned his face away when Jen dismissed me. I rose, carried the folder back to the desk, and slid it into the drawer. The wood closed with a quiet click that seemed to echo louder than any argument. I turned back to them. "I think we are done here." Jen grabbed the envelope from the table, clutching it against her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes flashing, but she said nothing. Mark stood slowly, his body heavy, his mouth twisting as though he wanted to speak. He looked at me once, his eyes wet, then dropped his gaze. I opened the door, letting the winter air rush in. They walked out without another word. Mark paused on the landing, glanced back as if searching for something he had already lost, then followed Jen into the dark hallway. When the door closed behind them, I rested my hand against the wood, breathing deeply. My hands no longer shook. The file had spoken for me louder than I ever could. I walked to the window. Outside, the snow was falling again, blanketing the street in white. The glow from the lamppost turned each flake into a tiny spark. I touched the glass, felt the cold seep through, and whispered to myself that the truth was no longer hidden. January arrived with gray skies and streets lined with dirty snowbanks, the kind of days when everything looks worn down. I drove past Oakwood Lane one morning on my way to the grocery store, curiosity pulling me despite myself. The Craftsman house that once glittered with holiday lights and catered parties stood with a large white sign staked in the front yard. "For sale," bold black letters shouting across the lawn. A bright red tag hung below announcing price reduced. I slowed the car and felt a heaviness in my chest. It was not triumph, not quite. More a quiet acknowledgement that the house had always been too much for them, too heavy for their shoulders. Now the world knew it too. Within weeks, the moving trucks appeared. I did not watch the whole thing, but I heard from a neighbor who called to tell me how Jen stood in the driveway, directing movers, while Mark kept his head down lifting boxes, as if the weight of them might keep him from collapsing altogether. The once proud house emptied quickly, stripped of the image they had clung to. Their new address was Maple Ridge, a modest neighborhood on the edge of town. Smaller homes, narrow yards, cars parked in driveways instead of behind iron gates. I passed by once and saw the little Cape Cod they had settled into shutters painted a tired blue, a sagging fence in back. There were no grand parties there, no catered feasts, just laundry hanging by the door and a tired wreath from the grocery store on the porch. Mark gave up the dream of his own firm. He took a job at a large financial company downtown, a steady position with long hours but reliable pay. I heard him admit to Ellen once, almost sheepishly, that it was easier not having to scramble for clients, easier not pretending he was more successful than he was. He rode the train every morning in a gray suit that no longer carried the swagger of independence. Jen turned her part-time dabbling into a full-time job. Real estate became her lifeline. I could almost see the bitterness in the way she spoke about open houses and commissions, no longer the lady of a grand home, hosting galas, but a worker pounding the pavement, her smile thinner now, less convincing. The children adjusted faster than anyone expected. Ellie left Ridgemont Academy behind and enrolled in Maple Ridge Middle, a public school with crowded hallways and chipped lockers. To everyone's surprise, she blossomed. She joined the advanced literature program, and I still remember her shy pride when she read me a poem she had written. She said she loved being in a class where kids talked about books instead of vacations. Jack discovered robotics, a club run out of the school library with old circuit boards and borrowed laptops. He threw himself into it, his laughter returning in a way I had not seen in years. One Saturday, he showed me a small robot that rolled across the floor beeping proudly. His eyes shone brighter than any expensive toy Jen had ever bought. The irony did not escape me. Jen had fought so hard to keep them at Ridgemont, insisting their futures depended on it, yet both children seemed lighter without the pressure of that private world. They carried fewer expectations on their backs, and in that freedom they thrived. Jen, however, could not hide her bitterness. One afternoon when I visited to drop off cookies, she stood stiffly in the kitchen, her smile brittle. "The kids are adjusting," she said, her voice clipped. "Too well, if you ask me. They act like they do not even miss Ridgemont." She sipped her coffee hard as if the taste offended her. I only nodded, keeping my words to myself. Mark was quieter these days. When he called me once a week, there was a tired honesty in his voice that had never been there before. He admitted things slowly, haltingly, as if ashamed. He said he had not realized how deep the mortgage had buried them, how much Jen had leaned on my silence. He never asked me for help again, but the apology hung in every pause between his sentences. Sometimes at night, I sat in my apartment and thought about karma, not in a vindictive way, but as a force that eventually balances the scales. They had lived for years on appearances paid for by me, and now they were learning to live on what they earned themselves. It was painful for them, yes, but there was also a strange peace in seeing the children thrive in simpler surroundings, the pretense stripped away. One Saturday, I drove out to Maple Ridge. The house was small but neat, the yard littered with soccer balls and chalk drawings. Ellie ran out to greet me, her arms full of notebooks. "Grandma," I wrote a story, she said breathlessly, already opening the pages to show me. Jack followed with his robot and tow wheels whirring against the pavement. Their joy filled the air. Jen lingered at the door, arms crossed, her face unreadable. She watched the children laugh, then turned away without a word. I knew the bitterness still burned in her, but in that moment it did not matter. The kids had found light in a smaller world, and no resentment could dim it. As I drove home that evening, I passed their old neighborhood. The craftsman house stood empty, curtains drawn, a new lockbox hanging on the door. A different family would soon fill it, unaware of the years of quiet transactions that had kept it alive. I felt no longing for it, no regret, only the certainty that the chapter was closed. The sky was streaked with winter pink as I pulled into my driveway. Inside, the tree still glowed in the corner, its light steady and calm. I sat in Robert's chair, hands folded, and let out a long breath. The weight of those years had not disappeared, but it had shifted. The scales were balancing one quiet day at a time. Spring thawed slowly that year, and with it something inside me loosened. I met Brenda Moore on a wet March afternoon, her umbrella bobbing as she hustled down the sidewalk toward my building with a folder tucked under her arm. She was brisk and kind in the same breath, the kind of person who remembered the names of doormen and asked after their children. We sat at my small table, steam rising from 2 mugs, and mapped out a plan. List the condo quickly, price it to move, keep my eye on Harbor Point in Delaware, where the bay narrows and the ocean voice is close enough to hear at night. The condo went under contract faster than I expected. I packed slowly, careful with the photo frames, careful with Robert's chair, careful most of all with a small ornament wrapped in tissue that said, "Robert and Mary." I labeled boxes by room and memory, then stood in each doorway, a last time thanking those rooms for holding me when the world felt thin. Brenda called almost daily, always with a new listing, always with a clear opinion that the yellow cottage on Seaview Lane was the one. We drove down to Harbor Point on a bright April morning. The town smelled like salt and fresh paint, and gulls traced lazy circles over the marina. The cottage stood 2 blocks from the water, with white trim and a porch wide enough for a swing. Inside, sunlight touched everything, the floorboards soft with age, a kitchen that fit one person comfortably too if they loved each other. I ran my hand over the window frame of the front room and felt a certainty settle in. Brenda watched my face and smiled like she had known all along. By May, the papers were signed. A local mover carried the few big pieces, and I made 3 trips in my car with boxes of books and the lemon-colored tin I always used for cookies. The first night I slept on clean sheets in the small back bedroom and woke to a sound that confused me at first, then made me laugh. The ocean talking through the open window. Days found a rhythm. Morning walks along the narrow boardwalk where fishermen in rubber boots nodded hello. Afternoons at the little market where the cashier called everyone honey and meant it. Evenings with a paperback and a blanket while the breeze lifted the curtains. Brenda stopped by once a week ostensibly to check on the paint touch-ups, really to share news and gossip. We became friends on those front steps, trading stories the way some women trade recipes. Neighbors folded me in before I could feel conspicuously new. Harriet lived 2 doors down, a retired librarian with sharp eyes and softer hands who made perfect scones and asked excellent questions. Ben lived across the lane, a widower who coaxed tomatoes and sweet peas from a narrow strip of soil as if it were an acre. They waved from porches and brought extra muffins and reminded me to set my trash out the night before the truck came. Each gesture stitched a small seam where I had felt torn. Summer warmed the town into a lazy kindness. I learned which stretch of beach stayed quiet at dusk and where the shells gathered after a storm. I kept the ornament wrapped in tissue in a drawer, saving it for a December I could not yet see. There was a comfort in waiting, in letting traditions rest until they could be reclaimed. By autumn, Mark's calls had steadied into a rhythm. He sounded tired but less brittle, and we talked about practical things. His commute, the kids' schedules. He never mentioned money. I never asked about it. He said Ellie was writing all the time that her teacher had noticed. He said Jack's robotics team had made it to a regional meet. With every small fact, I felt pride wash through me like a clean tide. As December neared, an idea began to take shape. I wanted a small tree, something simple. I found one at the corner lot, a narrow fir that fit neatly beside the front window. I strung white lights and chose only a handful of ornaments. Last, I lifted the tissue paper and held the porcelain in my palm. Robert and Mary in little gold script. I hung it at eye level, steadying it with a fingertip until it settled. The room felt different then, as if the cottage had drawn a breath with me. I called Mark the next day. I told him I would love to have the kids for an afternoon if it worked with their calendars. He sounded surprised, then pleased said he would speak to Jen and call me back. An hour later he did. His voice had the caution I had come to recognize. Jen would prefer to keep things simple this season, he said carefully. The kids have a lot going on. If you would like to see them in January, we can arrange something. Simple. That word again used like a gate. I thanked him and hung up, then spent an hour wiping non-existent crumbs from the countertop. By evening, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Jen. She said it was not the best time to be changing traditions. She said the drive was long. She said she wanted to avoid confusion. Her sentences circled without landing until I answered in a way that surprised both of us. The invitation is open. If Ellie wants to come bake cookies, I will be here. 3 days later, Mark called back with a different tone. Ellie has been asking. She wants to come by for a few hours. He cleared his throat. I can drop her off Saturday. Jen arrived with them, which I had expected. She stayed in the car while Ellie unbuckled. When Ellie reached my walkway, she turned back toward the passenger seat. Jen rolled down the window and said they had errands and might be early to pick up. Her eyes slid past me, taking in the porch, the smallness of the place, the string of lights looped along the railing. I felt the old sting and let it pass through. Ellie put her hand in mine as we stepped inside. The cottage smelled like butter and sugar already. We washed our hands and tied on aprons and mixed dough while she told me about a short story competition at school. She said her teacher liked a line about the sea breathing. I told her the sea really does if you listen near an open window at night. She laughed and said she would write that down. We rolled the dough and cut stars, and Trees laid them carefully on the cooled tin. While the first batch baked, we hung the last few ornaments together. Ellie spotted the porcelain one and touched it lightly with a fingertip. Grandpa, she said with a small smile. Her voice softened when she asked if we could put it front and center. We did. Cookies cooled on racks, and we made icing in bowls the colors of winter. She dotted little constellations of sugar on the stars and drew a lopsided garland on a tree. We ate one while it was still warm enough to fog the air between our faces. She hopped off the stool and wandered to the window, watching a gull wheel high above the street. When Mark returned, the sky had begun to dim. He came in to say hello, and I sent him back to the car with a plate under foil. Ellie tugged my sleeve near the doorway, stood on tiptoe, and leaned close. Her breath smelled like vanilla. I like Christmas here better, she whispered, and then she laughed like she felt shy and added that maybe it was just the cookies. Out on the curb, Jen thanked me without looking quite at me. Her smile was stretched thin in a way that felt familiar. She said Ellie had homework and they would be in touch. Mark met my eyes over the car roof for a second that felt longer than it was. Then the taillights were pulling away red smudges against the early dark. Back inside, I washed bowls and wiped the counter. The cottage was quiet except for the ocean voice at the edge of hearing. I turned off the lamp and left only the tree. The ornament caught the light and held it steady as if it had always belonged in this room. I carried a cookie to the porch and sat on the top step with a blanket over my knees, watching the few people out walking their dogs, listening to the soft slap of water on the pilings. The night carried a clean sort of peace, the kind that asks for nothing and gives back just enough. I stayed there until the cookie was gone and the chill edged in. Then I rose, went inside, and closed the door gently behind me. Spring arrived like a quiet apology, the kind that rests on your shoulders without asking for permission. The air softened and the bay shifted from iron gray to a kinder blue. I kept the front window open on afternoons when the wind would leave, and the cottage filled with the sound of water and gulls. There was trimming rosebush that Ben had insisted would take in this sandy soil when I heard footsteps on the walk and a knock that was careful, not urgent. When I opened the door, Mark stood on the porch with his hands empty and his shoulders a little lower than I remembered. He asked if he could come in. I stepped aside. He looked around the front room as if taking stock of a life he did not know yet. He said the place suited me. I said it did. We stood in that polite space for a moment, both of us listening to the small things, the clock, the breeze, a gull calling once across the lane. I made coffee and we sat at the small table beneath the window. He wrapped his hands around the mug as if he needed the warmth. He did not speak right away. When he did, his voice was smaller, unvarnished. He said he was sorry. He said he had told himself stories that made it easier to look away. He said he had taken because taking had become background noise, like a faucet left dripping in another room. He said he knew sorry did not undo anything. I let the words come without rescuing him. I kept my hands around my own cup and listened to the scrape of his breath when he ran out of sentences. Then I asked what had changed. He gave a half laugh that held no humor and said life, and then he added that moving had stripped something that vacuuming a rented carpet in a smaller house had sounded like a truth he could not ignore. He said Ellie had taped her poems to the wall, and Jack had built a robot from parts someone else had thrown away, and that both of them were lighter and that it hurt in a good way to see that. He reached into his jacket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. He said it was a simple plan. A small amount every month, not enough to pretend it settled anything, just enough to keep his word. He said he wanted to prove to himself that he could give rather than take. He looked at me as if bracing for refusal. I unfolded the page and read his careful numbers. It was not much. It was also not nothing. I told him I would accept it and keep it separate. I said I might set it aside for something that mattered to the children, a class trip, a camp, a stack of books, nothing grand, everything honest. I told him I needed him to hear what mattered most. Respect. That word sat between us like a cornerstone. I said I needed to be included as a person, not as a convenient pocket. That I would not be spoken to through lawyers again. That if there was a problem, he would speak to me plainly, and if the answer was no, he would accept it like a man who finally trusted himself to stand. He nodded quickly, then slower, like the shape of it was settling in his bones. He said he understood. He said he had already told Jen that there would be no more letters. He did not ask me to forgive her, and I was grateful for that. We took our coffee to the porch. The ocean voice was steady, a breath moving in and out of some older chest. He pointed at the ornament through the window and said he had noticed it when he came in. He said he missed Dad most when he felt small. I said I did too. We sat with that for a while, quiet and simple. He finally stood and asked if the kids might come for a weekend when school let out. I told him they would always be welcome and that we would keep the days modest and full. He laughed and said Ellie had already planned a menu that included cookies for breakfast. At the gate, he pulled me into a hug that did not try to erase anything. He smelled like train air and coffee and the paper of the plan in his pocket. He said he would call on Sunday to work out dates. I watched him walk down the lane and turn toward the bus stop, a man finally learning the size of his own life. After he left, I called Rick and told him about the plan. He said it was fine to accept if I wanted to, and he said what mattered most was the boundary I had drawn. He reminded me to keep my records not out of fear anymore, but because truth deserves a place to live. I put the paper in a small envelope and wrote a date on the front. Then I slipped it into the drawer that held so many pages of what had been and closed it gently. Weeks found their new shape. Ellie came down for a Saturday and helped me plant herbs in old clay pots. She read me a poem about the sea that had the sound of breath in it. Jack arrived a week later and brought a small motor to show Ben, who took it apart and put it together twice while Jack watched with shining eyes. They ate cookies warm from the oven and dozed on the couch under a blanket that smelled like detergent and salt. When Mark picked them up, he stood on the porch and accepted a paper plate with the last of the batch, the foil crinkling in his hands like music. Jen came once in June. She wore a simple sweater and looked at the water more than she looked at me. She thanked me for watching the kids and said their school year had ended better than she expected. Her voice held the careful tone of someone learning a new language. I did not press. She left with a small bag of shells Ellie had collected for her, and for a moment at the car door, her mouth softened in a way I had not seen in a long time. It was not acceptance. It was not apology. It was a beginning that asked for time. On a clear afternoon near the end of spring, I walked the narrow beach at low tide and let the edge of the water catch my ankles. The air smelled like new things. I carried a small sandwich and an apple and sat on a flat rock facing east. I thought about the years I had spent as a quiet engine under someone else's show. I thought about the night at the door when I chose to swallow my words and keep my dignity, and the morning after when I told the truth to myself for the first time in years. I thought about the folder in my desk that had started as a shame and become a spine. People believed I would always be quiet. They counted on the version of me who smiled and nodded and paid. In the end, it was not my raised voice that changed anything. It was the 5 years caught in black and white that stopped their mouths. When I set those pages on the table, I felt something rise in me that I had missed since Robert died. A steadiness that did not ask permission. I walked back to the cottage in the late light, the boards warm beneath my feet. I turned on the small lamp in the front room and stood for a moment looking at the tree now bare of December's ornaments, but still holding space in the corner where it would return. The room felt like a held breath ready to release. I placed my hand on the back of Robert's chair and let my shoulders drop. This next Christmas would be my own. Not grand, not loud, not built on credit. A table with room enough for whoever chose to come as family, and peace, even if they did not. That night, I wrote a note to myself and tucked it in the drawer beside the envelope with Mark's new plan. I wrote that respect would be my measure, not guilt. I wrote that love would not depend on invoices. I wrote that silence can be a wall and also a shelter, and that I would choose which one it was from here on. If any part of this story feels like your own, you can stay with me a little longer. Tell me where you are in your tides, what you kept quiet, what you chose to change. Share your thoughts in the comments. Add your voice to mine. And if you want more stories like this, you can follow along so we can keep each other company when the water sounds loud and the night asks for light.